yet. So
sorry.
I'll just introduce the speaker. We've got Christopher Markwell from Queensland Fire and Emergency Services. He's going to do a presentation on a thermal incident involving a battery energy storage system. Firstly, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, and I would like to pay my respects to the elders past and present, and I'll hand it over to Chris to get underway.
All right, thank you. I'll just, someone could verify, can you see my screen? All right, that's a great start.
No, not yet.
Not yet? All right, hang on.
We can hear you, see you, but not the screen share.
All right, might be a lag.
Here we go. It's coming through. Yep, we're good.
All right, so you see the presentation?
Yep.
Yep, fantastic. Give me a sec. All right, yeah, so firstly, thanks to New South Wales Association of Fire Investigators for the opportunity to speak about this job. It's not a recent one, I have to be straight up. It'll be 3 years ago this March. So while it's not a very recent event, it's one of the major incidents to occur on Australian soil. And so we've got, as we had access, it was in our own backyard. It was a pretty good one to do some review. We'll get through it, but pardon me, the building is in the grounds of the Griffith University building in Brisbane. And I again wish to thank the Griffith University themselves for the opportunity to present on this case study, as I'll call it. They were very helpful in providing us with access to the site, both during the investigation and post-review analysis, and very helpful in providing a lot of information. So here we go. In terms of what I'll try to do today is I'll talk through, give you some insight into the building design, and I'll outline the existing National Construction Code requirements at the time it was built. Talk about the battery room and the battery bank design. It is a very complex system, so I'll be pretty concise on that. But the next slide will have a YouTube link address if you want to search that yourself in your own time. It gives you a good 5-minute rundown on how the building actually functioned. While the functioning of it's not a key element of today's discussion, it does help to understand what a complex building it is. We'll talk about basically the fire service intervention actions and the complexities that these kind of things are posing for firefighters. Again, principally part of today's discussion, we'll talk about the fire patterns and the interpretation of them, what they suggested about the incident, and the supportive evidence they gained to verify some of the other facts that we uncovered. The fire investigation outcomes, scene handover requirements, and again, I'll sort of close out with the impact on the building code review. And while that may not impact on everyone, it's a very contemporary discussion about the suitability of existing building codes to provide protection for occupants, structures, and firefighters or fire investigators even in review of these kind of incidents. Okay, so again, just take your time, but that address on the top and the spaces after the YouTube / underscore, just for your reference. So if you're writing that down, just include those in it. So the building was an incredibly complex building. It was designed to have off-grid operation. And we'll go through that in a little bit more detail. There was a solar array across the entire rooftop of the building, at some 200 square meters of solar PV. And the awnings that are on the leeward side of the building, the side that you can't see, equally housed solar array. So it had capacity of some 300 kilowatts of DC storage capacity that fed into the system, that also had an inbuilt hydrogen electrolyzer system that produced hydrogen on the site and stored that in a metal hydride facility, fortunately not within the same building, but in an adjacent structure. So while the hydrogen facility is not an element of this, it was a key component of how the system actually worked together. And we can bring that link up later on, or Mick's got it if everyone needs to search that further themselves. So again, in principle and in very broad terms, so when there was plenty of sun shining, the building would disconnect from the grid and start to charge the battery banks. So the battery banks also powered the hydrogen electrolyzer, which would in turn power the building. and with the capacity to export excess energy to the grid from the battery banks. When the solar generation capacity dropped below certain levels to produce the hydrogen, the electrolyzer would shut down and the batteries would then power the building. So where the batteries reached a low state of charge, the metal hydride system would kick in and support the needs of the building. So it's a constant interplay between the two stored energy systems. And when the stored energy levels of both renewables drop below a functional level, the building would then reconnect to the grid until the sun started to shine. And I'm happy to say in Queensland, that's most days of the week. So in terms of the construction, again, pretty broad overview. So the building was certified in 2012 and modifications were adopted. Now, just for the record, within Queensland Fire Emergency Service is a legislated referral agency to the building certifier, who's the nominated assessment person for the building approvals process. So we get the opportunity to review buildings to provide advice on the fire safety installations. But very importantly, this one is not flagged as any of the kind of things that we are legislatively allowed to review. So in NCC terms, it's pretty typical type A construction, heavy concrete, particular fire resistance ratings, 5-story. Classifies offices, essentially non-assembly buildings, which was lecture rooms. The adjacent building was classified as a class 10. And very particularly the plant room or the ancillary equipment, which is the rooftop level, was where the battery bank was stored. So it was only reported as a battery room at the time of construction. So there's no mention or no awareness for the fire service that there was ever proposed to be a lithium battery bank stored in this location. And equally, no obligation for any party to report to us. So in terms of the fire safety installations, it had, all the bells and whistles you'd expect for a type A high priority building: detection, early warning indication, emergency lighting, fire main, sprinkler valve, so forth and so on. Again, and please pardon me if I'm preaching to the converted, but this is an important part of today's discussion. So in terms of the building overview, there is a requirement for a thing called a fire resistance level. Now, the building code, depending on the nature of the building and all the things, the size, the height, the occupancy, so forth, it will prescribe a fire resistance level for certain elements of the structure. Now, as you can see on the screen, they're reported incrementally in sequences of minutes on a grid system of structural adequacy, which is the capacity of that individual element to maintain its structural adequacy or its stability, principally for load-bearing purposes. Its structural integrity, and that's its ability to resist the passage of flame across the actual item, and its structural insulation or its insulation capacity. And that effectively is about its capacity to stop temperature transfer through that element from the hot side to the cold side. And again, they're rated incrementally in a number of minutes, and we'll see that. So again, they are all based on an established set of Australian standards testing protocols. And as we'll see later, a review of those protocols is really, in our view, a pretty necessary requirement, because the capacity of the prescriptive code for the resistance levels in place in this building were arguably overrun by the fuel load that the battery bank proposed or presented. Excuse me. So this is just to give you some overview of the building. This is the top floor of the building where the plant room was actually located. And the compartment design is a really important element as well. You'll observe there's a big local, a big wide transport area or passageway, and that the compartment itself, so in terms of its FRL, it was had a structural adequacy of 120 minutes, insulation of 120, and integrity of 120. So a pretty strong structure by most standards. Excuse me. But very importantly was the orientation of the roof structure. So as we look at the image, it goes from low at the rear of the compartment to high at the front of the entrance point. And I'd ask you to just take the time to measure out in your own minds the distance across that passageway causeway. By our calcs, it's some 3 to 4 meters wide. And on the very outside of the right image, as you see, were weather shield screens. And you'll see the significance of those later on. So we calculate there's some 4 to 5 meters from the doorway opening to the outside edge of those screens. And the metal balustrade proved to be very important as well. So the building actually had a sprinkler system installed, but external to the compartment in the open causeway. I'm not sure if you see my mouse moving across the screen, but I'm just pointing to one of the sprinkler heads there. So directly above the door openings, but only external to the compartment. And again, that's part of the NCC requirements. They're not required to be internal to the compartment. Had hydrant takeoff points at either end of the building in the stairwell, and that's pretty standard practice in terms of access. And again, fortunately for us, open to atmosphere on a rooftop level. So this is internal to the compartment, and I would point out this is post-overhaul, post-scene rectification. It has been chemically and laser cleaned, so this is not what it looked like after the fire. This is about as clean as it will ever get, probably cleaner than when they first built it. But just in terms of the building, so you'll see there was a single rear access door, just a standard access door, normal height in the back left corner. The HVAC air supply vents were high on the rear wall. The ceiling was lined with 2 levels of 16mm fire rated gypsum board, which is standard fire separation between tenancies, but in this case met the minimum fire resistance level for the structure. And then again, the concrete walls had a 120-minute rating. So again, to give you some orientation, very steep angle of the roof incline. The HVAC return air vent was up high on the front allocation. That obviously fed outwards through a return air ducting. It was important to note there was no return air smoke detection in the ducting, which is normally a prompt to shut down the incoming air conditioning supply. So again, part of the review of the building management systems, there was some omissions in the design that may or may not have had a positive effect on the isolation of incoming ventilation. And that portal, as you see there, was controlled by a fusible link smoke damper. On the other side, again, there's a small rear access door and another high level vent, but this was for the exhaust ventilation system. So again, as you see, a large quantity of lithium batteries stored within the room. And in the early design, they noticed there was some just incremental off-gassing of the batteries during their heating phase. So they installed an exhaust ventilation. So the air systems within the compartment were actually cycled through on a periodic basis, and there was a monitoring system in play as well. And this is from the rear of the compartment looking out towards the double door entry point. And again, highlights the what I'll call the receptive void in the top part of the compartment. So once in terms of ventilation points, so the upper outflow ducts were the first points, but again, protected by fusible dampers, which did activate and seal off the compartment. So therefore, the next available lowest ventilation point became the top of the doorways. So by our calcs, there's about 30 cubic meters in the upper compartment of the room that had no outflow ventilation points. So a stored capacity of 30 cubic meters, or a smoke reservoir, if you like. And holistically, the rest of the compartment had about a further 90 cubic meters. So overall, about 120 minutes of cubic space for the development of fumes. Okay, so in terms of the battery room and the battery systems, I'll just try to explain it again, incredibly complex, but what you're looking at there is one of the 2 battery banks that existed within this room. And that was pretty much all that was in there. It was a purpose-built battery room. Pardon me. So there were 2 battery banks, each consisting of 4 strings. Now the strings are the horizontal lines that you see there in that particular row that we're looking at. And what you're seeing there is one half of one of the battery banks. So each string had 128 batteries in each string, double-sided racking. And so in total, there were some, 1,064 batteries in the system, all of them rated at 3 volts DC with a capacity of 400 amp hours each. So each battery bank, as a holistic bank, was controlled by an individual switchboard isolator, and you see that on the right. And each string had its own isolation management system. So they're numerically identified, and this was important in the review of the battery management system data, numerically identified from the top to the bottom as 1, 2, 3, and 4 being the lowermost string. So in terms of a close-up, there's 2 individual batteries side by side, and 4 of those batteries formed an individual cell. So again, each of the batteries, lithium-ion phosphate technology, which was very contemporary at the time and is still being used. But again, the scale of these batteries is much larger than what's being commercially produced today. But irrespective, the same chemistry is what is up for review. So each cell, so that's 8 batteries, each cell had a cell management unit, and it monitored the voltage and the temperature across each of the batteries, and had a protective shield over the terminals, which is for basic drop contact to avoid arcing. But very important to remember, there was no cooling system other than the ambient air conditioning system for the room. So no direct cooling installed throughout any of the batteries. They were cooled atmospherically by the air conditioning system within the room. I'll put this up just again as an explanation. So the intervention, 2 urban pumpers, 1 urban rescue, second alarm structure, which is an incremental upgrade for additional resources required, and that's based on the level of fire that's present. An additional 2 urban pumpers, hazmat response, incident control, senior officer and scientific. We don't usually need the senior officers to turn up, but they look good on the media, and they sort of get in the way. But you got to do what you got to do. So, and subsequently there was 2 urban pumpers on a further fire watch. So, from the time of call at around 2000 hours, it wasn't under control for a number of hours, but the fire watch ran from midnight through to midnight the next day, and there was a large, so quite a resource drag for the response to this incident. It's fair to say that in most urban cities that response can be reasonably managed, but you can imagine if this happens in a small regional jurisdiction where there may be 1 and at best 2 urban response pumpers, or a rural based or auxiliary, or a retained, or whatever you might call them in your particular areas, are the only available response. So these incidents do require a certain level of capacity and response. And if you've had any exposure to the big battery fire in Moorabool, after a week of relay pumping across 2.5 kilometres, it's a massive resource drag. So these kind of incidents are causing us as fire service responders a massive logistical complexities. Okay, I've included this, but I won't drag you through each sentence. So the main things in terms of a timestamp, it just flags out the key sort of stages as the event unfolded. Basically, there's an automated alarm in the system as required, monitored by the fire service, or monitored by a company that provides notification to the fire service. So we get the 000 call, we get the alarm activation, the direct alarm activation, and roll down the road. So they're on site within about 10 minutes, which is pretty traditional in most areas. And on arrival, security advisor and the fire's active on level 5. So very important to know that the sprinkler had not activated. So this was a smoke alarm ASC activation only. The sprinkler was not activated prior to their arrival, but did arrive at about the same time. So about 10 minutes from the first smoke detector activation internal to the compartment, the external sprinkler has activated.
Chris, we've got a question there. Just what season did the fire occur, and what was, I guess, the temperatures outside on that day?
Look, I can tell you exactly, it was March in the year that it occurred, in March in 2020. Okay. Seasonally, that's pretty warm in Queensland, but again, it's in an atmospherically controlled building, so there shouldn't be any external impact on the batteries in the location that they were installed within.
Great.
Pardon me. So, and we'll get to it. So again, they had to make forced entry to the compartment. They did have on-site security who walked them to the floor, and we'll see that again in a minute. But then the security guard made the personal risk assessment that he needed to relocate to another area and took the access keys with him. So then they had to forcibly break their way into the compartment using reciprocal cutters. That subsequently proved to be difficult. At the depth of the fire-rated door was about 5 mils deeper than the blade on the cutting saw, so they had some trouble getting in. So some delay. And again, at the same time, the overhead sprinkler was raining down above them, and they've had fire emitting out from the base of the door. Once they did get in, again, this is about 2000 hours at night, so already pitch black in Queensland at that time. Pardon me. A very dense smoke, so they couldn't really see anything, and even with thermal cameras, all they could see was heat signature on the one quadrant of the room. They couldn't identify anything else. They had a base area that they could operate on from or approach. and they deployed what we term as a gas cooling technique. So again, please, if you're fully familiar, I'll just appraise that to anyone who doesn't know what that means. It's generally a wide spray pattern on a high pressure with intermittent pulses of water put into the upper atmosphere. And the intention is that the highly atomized suppression stream has a mass interaction with the heat signature or the stored energy in the room to dissipate the potential ignition of a smoke plume. It's particularly used for compartment fires where there's no external ventilation. So they were doing that intermittently, hooked up to the available attack lines, having very little success. So what they continually faced was massive outflow pulses of plume ignition. They were external to the compartment the whole time. Then they did manage to get access to one of the small side doors that we identified early and tried a technique called hydraulic ventilation, where again, you stand in the doorway, face the suppression stream outwards, open a wide spray pattern, and the induced airflow has the intent, and it does generally work, to suck the smoke out of the compartment and draw it out with the induction in the water stream. Again, very smoke dense, big smoke reservoir, had little to no effect. They abandoned that very quickly. But very importantly, they left that door open. So now they had 2 available air tracks into this sealed compartment. Shortly thereafter, they had the first of what they reported as gas phase explosions, quite strong outflow. And at that stage, they thought they had power isolated, but they made a tactical decision to incrementally withdraw. They went through the grid, through the process to try and get the entire building disconnected from the grid. And of course, what they didn't realize is that they were dealing with a stored energy system. No matter that you turn the power off at the wall, the stored energy remains intact within the battery system. Again, at about 30 minutes, so the red markers are the timestamp from access intervention, another massive gas phase explosion. Firefighters who were some 2 meters external to the compartment were knocked off their feet and displaced some several meters across the external passageway. The only thing that stopped them going over the level of the 5th floor building was the wrought iron balustrade that saved them and stopped them from going any further. So pretty lucky all around. Lucky they were in a crouched position attack. Most of the blast wave went over their head, but significant force to displace them. Both of them hospitalised with concussion, off work for a couple of weeks, cooked helmets. Not a good outcome, but not a bad one either because they got out of it alive. Shortly thereafter, the fire was brought under control. So the key issue, about 90 minutes from arrival to intervention before it was contained. All right. So that's fortunately footage shot by the security guard on approach following the crews in. And if you missed it, he identifies it as a fully sick fire. So I would agree. So again, great confirmation for us. And obviously we're all, as fire investigators, interested in talking to the first attending crews and what did they see, what they're observing. But here we've got firsthand, we've got visual evidence as well as the reported anecdotal stuff, and the patterns did support that. So high intensity flame emanating from the base of the door on their approach, and overhead sprinkler already activated some 4 meters above the nearest plume height. So we can do the crude calcs on that. But again, there's a lot of temperature emitting from this compartment, which is effectively an airtight sealed compartment because the internal smoke dampers had isolated and locked up the compartment. Pardon me, I'll just get to my notes. All right. Slide lock up. So this is, again, good old YouTube John Citizen footage. This is the crews still approaching the sealed doors. So the doors are shut but flexing under the internal pressure of the fire. So at this stage, it is a ventilation controlled fire. So it's only suffering from a lack of oxygen internal to the compartment. Fuel rich, no problem with the decomposition or the pyrolysis of the decomposing fire source. Energy rich, it's got the temperature. The only thing it's lacking is sufficient oxygen. And I'll just go back for that one. Try and make that run again. Pardon me. So intermittent flame, the door is still sealed and locked, but again, good anecdotal evidence of what's occurring internal to the compartment. prior to any kind of intervention by us. And it raises the question that if the fire service did not intervene and open the doors to the compartment, what would have happened? There's an absolutely self-sustaining, working, self-propagating fire internal to the compartment. All it needs is available oxygen. It's got that outside, so there was nothing stopping the chemical reaction that was going on inside that compartment. The next one is a bit of the wake up and smell the roses, and is the blast wave footage, and I'll let it speak for itself. So if you remember from the earlier vision that we looked at, the passageway is some 3 to 4 meters wide. The weather screens are some 5 to 6 meters from the doorway, and there's a significant outflow beyond that. Okay, moving right along. So in terms, we were there for a number of hours. This is sort of the technical aspect of the fire response, and I won't drag you through that too much, but obviously a lot of atmospheric testing go on. It was determined once the fire was out, there was no entry without breathing apparatus until the atmosphere could be validated. Started a sample of fire stream. We had a fair bit of runoff going into it. Again, where these installations are located in the building is a really important part. We had significant concerns over what we term to be stranded energy within the fire damaged batteries. And what we mean by that, if you're not familiar with the term, is even though the flaming combustion may be contained, there still is stored voltage in the batteries themselves, and they have the potential at any time to reignite, to kick off the whole thermal runaway process. So there's a lot of concerns with post-damaged lithium battery cells. And again, big concerns over the power isolation. So there's as the sun was coming up in several hours, there's a 300 kilowatt solar system on the roof that's going to start feeding into this battery bank. So a few things to worry about in the handover. Griffith were fantastic. They implemented periodic ongoing temperature monitoring, full de-energization of the site. Obviously, they had to get structural integrity issues, structural engineer to review the building, residue testing, lots of different things. And the laser cleaning. So it was a very complex cleanup for them. The site's still not reoccupied to this day, but it took them several weeks before they could even get as far as decommissioning the damaged cells. So I'll get to the interesting bit, the fire patterns. So this is the approach to the doors, and again, standard practice for us to make entry to a sealed compartment in the absence of keys that a security guard's got swinging on his belt, is to cut an inverted V into the base of the door, break the panel down, place a suppression stream in, and to put some intermittent water sprays in to mitigate the energy before we make entry. So as you'll observe, they have some problems, and as I mentioned, the depth of the door was about 5 mil deeper than the thickness of the blade they had for the cutting saw. So you can appreciate how well it was going with a sprinkler act to the top of your head and you can't quite get through. They did manage to do it eventually. And the real important part that I hope you're observing is what I will call the heat demarcation patterns on the door. Now, important to remember, this door has a 30-minute thermal and insulation rating, and it had sustained, by the time we made entry, about 20 minutes of direct heat exposure, albeit only 10 meters of that at the late stage where it was flaming externally. So the question is, how effective is this 30-minute FRL door against what it's required to contain? And the question is that if the fire service does not intervene and allows this door to remain in place, how long does it take before the door fails and suddenly there's an uncontrolled fire coming out of that compartment? So again, in terms of the patterns, and this is the right side door from viewing from the outside, and was the door that was in closest proximity to the battery bank where the fire source was actually determined to occur. So as you'll observe, very wide pattern at the base of the door. So the heat demarcation, or the distortion in the metal, the burning of the paint's pretty superficial, but the distortion of the metal is indicative of the temperature that it's sustained. So very strong indicators, irrespective of the camera footage or talking to any of the fire crews about what had actually occurred, where the heat exposure was on the fire doors themselves. This is that same door at the upper section. So again, equally intriguing, why was there less intensity in the upper part of the door? So the highest level, normally we would consider the highest outflow of heat to be in the highest part of the room. But in this case, we had the 30 cubic meter void above the lowest ventilation point, which is this intersection of the top door hinge that we're looking at. So what we theorised is that during the developmental stage, when the smoke plume progressed back downward, so it's banked up within the room, incrementally getting lower and lower and lower, at that stage in the fire development, it was still very much ventilation controlled. So, sorry, still very much fuel controlled. So the battery had started to decompose. It had sufficient energy, had enough air within the compartment, but the combustion reaction was not intense to cause the level of heat outflow that we saw at the base of the door once the combustion got underway or progressed to the level that it did. So again, basic observation of the patterns and what do they represent about the sequence of fire development at that time. And the inside of the doors was even better. So painted surface inside. So you'll observe that from the top part down to about halfway, the paint is almost incrementally totally intact, just soot stained. So again, very strong indicator of level of temperature internal to the room in terms of the lowering of the smoke plane or the neutral plane, or however you choose to call it, smoke horizon. But then below that point, we note that the temperature increases. So again, it's speaking to the rate of fire reaction internal to the compartment. So the intensity of the combustion reaction was much greater in the lower part of the room. And this is supported by the external flaming that we saw. And equally that was the only available air track into the compartment. So the combustion reaction can only occur where there's sufficient oxygen, fuel rich, temperature rich, everything it needs except available oxygen. So that's why the intensity was in that particular location. Again, and the leading door on the left-hand side, not as damaged. Again, further away, basic radiated heat projection, so sustained less damage. Just a shot of the fusible link smoke damper shut. So it did its job perfectly to protect the outflow infrastructure and the return air ducting, but arguably had the effect of pressurizing the compartment because there was nowhere for the produced fire plume to go when that had the smoke reservoir in the top part of the building. So this is the battery bank's post-fire, and this is battery bank 1, which was on the left-hand side. Pretty much intact, and again, which was surprising. So we think about radiated heat projecting across open space, but there was pretty much a dominant convective plume-driven fire. And again, by our observations, supported by the intensity of the heat release, excuse me. But importantly, the overhead cable trays were completely destroyed. So a lot of high level heat above the battery bank racks. And this is the battery bank 2, where the fire was determined to have originated. So hopefully all the fire investigators in the room are reading the pattern pretty cleanly. It's putting you back to the front right-hand corner of the image as we look at it. And again, the strings, as I identified them before, from the topmost to the lowermost. And that becomes really important in the discussions about what the BMS revealed, the battery management system. I mean, I'll just check a note. So I've got to talk some commentary on this one. So, so again, what was reported to us in the review of the systems was the strings as we see them. String 1 and 2, so the two uppermost, were at a 90% state of charge. So the entire system was connected and functioning as intended, feeding power back into the building. Pardon me. String 3 was at 50% charge and was actually isolated from the internal mechanism. So it wasn't providing power to any part of the other mechanism network. And string 4 was equally isolated. So, excuse me. And again, so based on the total volume of batteries that were available as the fuel load, our calculations are that only 10% of the potential stored energy in the room was a contributing fuel source feature. So if we're trying to work out how much of the fire was driven, what created the fire, arguably only 10% of the available fuel was the contributing to the fire that took them some 90 minutes to contain. Now, when you've got a 2-hour fire rated structure and a 10% fuel load that burns for 90 minutes, I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions about what would have happened if the fire service had not intervened in this matter. So if we've not brought suppression resources to this and reduced the rate of reaction and reduced the ongoing exposure to the other cells, arguably it was a self-sustaining fire internally. The whole thing could have consumed and, in our view, quite credibly could have overrun the entire FRL of the structure. Okay, a bit of a close-up of it. Again, pretty basic upward-outward V pattern observable there from a low point here, rising upwards and outwards, incremental damage. So it was, as I mentioned before, it was very much a convective plume-driven fire exposure. And one of the key factors in the subsequent exposure was the simplicity of the orientation of the cells stacked vertically one above each other. So this speaks to the design installation was in fact a contributing factor for additional fuel being exposed from a small fire that started on a single level. Basic convective heat rise exposed the fuel levels above it, exposed the fuel levels above it, incremental V pattern upwards and outwards. So it's a discussion on the suitability or the installation design and how effectively do they maintain or mitigate or contribute to additional fire growth. Through this picture in, because it's really interesting. So these batteries were not involved in the direct plume, but on the outwards edge of the V, if you like. But pretty clearly they sustained significant thermal damage. And the tricky bit is that they, what occurs is they, like any pressure vessel that's exposed to external heat, the internal pressure builds up, and I'm sure you can observe they've all split their own casings, overpressurized internally. And so incrementally, the peripheral edges of the plume, preheating of all the available fuel, they split, rupture, overgas. So they're continually purging and surging additional combustible gases into the fire plume. So it's very much a self-sustaining fire source on the outer edges of the fire development. This is a 3 millimeter thick, 25 square galvanized steel tube racking. So that's not a melt pattern. If you're not familiar, that is indicative of an electrical arc. So the crews did report to us, they thought there was electrical arcing or smoke explosions going on. So again, part of our analysis is that we believe that there was definitely electrical arcing occurring, a high energy system, no question about that. But equally the high density of the smoke plume and the high carbon intensity. So we believe they're actually experiencing, if you like, lightning arcs tracking through the high density carbon smoke internal to the compartment. So a pretty complex issue for them to face, pardon me. And again, what do? You just to try and deal with it in terms of what's in front of you at 9 o'clock on a dark night when you can't even see what's going on. So again, anecdotally, just the nature of the batteries, thermosetting plastics just melted and fall away. So composition contributes to the spread of fire across the site. That's a photo of one of the firefighters' visors, completely displaced from his helmet. Fortunately, his helmet remained intact on his head, but his visor was relocated some 6 meters away from where he was standing. So just indicative of the risk profiles that they face. And we'll try to get concisely, I'm conscious of the time, the fire investigation basics. So I'm sure you're all familiar. It's the what, where, and how. What was the sequence of activities, defect, act, or emission, source of ignition and adjacent fuel exposure, and how did it come to be that the fire escalated to create such explosive force? And I'll try to address those. So the battery management system and the fire indicator panel turned out to be really critical sources of information in the post-incident analysis. So the BMS system, and again, so accessing this data or understanding if it exists or sourcing it from a fire investigation perspective are really important aspects of the post-scene investigation. Fire indicator panels, certainly contemporary ones, may have, pardon me, individually itemized detectors. So you may be able to identify exactly what detector activated at exactly what time, and be able to track the progression of a fire across a certain room based on the activation sequences of detectors. In this case, there was only one smoke detector in the room, so it's not very helpful, but it did provide some anecdotal evidence to us. So the battery management system, battery bank was active. String 1 and 4 were in operation. 2 was isolated, but yeah, again, high percentage charge, and 3 not functioning at all. Sorry, I misreported. 1 and 4 were active. 3 was isolated. 2 not connected on trickle charge. So in terms of the numbers, and I won't drag you through reading every word, but you can see the key differences here. So The fire indicator panel reported that the smoke detector in the battery room, that's the alert notification that fed through the monitoring, activated at a certain time. In alignment with the battery management system, there was some 7 seconds between when the smoke detector activated and the battery management system reported a voltage drop in an individual cell. So again, what this confirms for us is that there is and we know this anecdotally now, there is generally a massive off-gassing of decomposition fumes from the batteries in the early stages. So this is evidenced, we believe, by the activation of the detector prior to the voltage drop being reported by the battery management system. So the thermal runaway event has occurred. There's been some initial off-gassing occurring, sufficient to reach this, the detector on the ceiling height. But then shortly thereafter, very pretty in line timing with the timing, the battery management system reports a massive voltage drop and an instantaneous temperature rise across that individual cell. Shortly thereafter, so again, some 9 seconds later, the HVAC temperature sensor on the roof rises to 110 degrees and then ceases to report any further. So we found that melted off the ceiling on the floor. So it sustained this reporting for about 30 seconds and then that was it. And again, then the battery management system for string 2, which was vertically aligned directly above the failure sequence, reported a massive temperature rise and voltage drop and subsequent failure. So again, something like about 120 seconds from the first smoke detector activation to a subsequent escalation of the fire from battery bank to battery bank. And subsequently, the sprinkler external to the room operated. It's a very complex battery management system review, but the short story is that a catastrophic voltage drop in one of the cells directly attributed to a short circuit, and they had been having some ongoing problems with some of the individual cells. They were quite aged by this time, some 7 to 8 years old, led to a rapid exothermic reaction, so a heat-producing reaction within the one individual cell. The sheer orientation of the cells stacked above each other, the flame plume just exposed all the other incremental fuel load above it and around it. And the compartment design was a contributing factor in the containment of the off-gassing fumes. So the smoke dampers self-isolating and isolating the outflow points, the 30-metre cubic void above the next available lowest point being the top of the doors, meant that there was a very large smoke reservoir above the lowest available ventilation points. So what we do know that lithium batteries in decomposition produce their own hydrogen, which is just a fantastic result. And that hydrogen has a vapor density which is lighter than air, so 0.7. So just with the hydrogen release alone, it rises to the upper section of the compartment. And with the contributing factor of the buoyant plume, so there's masses of stored energy being directed upwards and contained within the compartment. Hydrogen also happens to have a flammability range of between 4 to 75% and a very low ignition temperature. So with a working fire and a range of ignition potential that broad, it's no surprise that they were facing intermittent ignition of the smoke plume in the upper atmosphere, and the time frame between when they withdrew, when they reinstated suppression activities, allowed sufficient concentration of that fume to build up to create the explosive force and the deflagration reaction that we observed. Pardon me. So again, and I'll restate this. So it's worth noting that across the two battery banks, approximately around 120 or 10% of the available fuel cells were a contributing factor. So for us, this raises really serious discussions about the building code specifications for fire resistance levels around these kind of fuel loads, as I was unashamedly call them. Yes, it is a battery room, but the nature of the chemistry within these batteries poses massive questions for the capacity of the building to sustain any fire that develops in that area. Of course, it would be remiss of me to not report on how well the building actually did perform, irrespective of whether it was designed to perform for this particular fire source feature. Detection did activate and provided notification both to the occupants, albeit none on site, and first responders. So we've got detection notification. That's a great first step in the system. The air handling systems did operate as designed. The smoke dampers activated and isolated the compartment or stopped the outflow of smoke to the adjacent compartments. but it equally had the contributing factor for allowing the buildup of residual fuel in that smoke void. So again, the compartment design, something as simply as the pitch of a roof, becomes a really important factor for where these kind of installations are installed. The fire resistance level certainly proved that it was capable of sustaining the initial fire duration with minimal damage. So the 2-hour rated concrete walls held up pretty well, but arguably they only sustained 60 minutes of fire load before the intervention occurred. The doors were opened and the heat transfer was then external to the compartment. But the fire doors were subjectively right on the edge of sustaining what they were intended to do. 30-minute doors copped about a good 20 to 25 minutes of exposure and were arguably right on the brink of failing entirely. So again, comes to the issue of what happens in the absence of intervention. And the sprinkler, albeit not designed or intended for that, did activate and did provide a protective misting spray on the outside of the compartment. So arguably would have had some literal effect, although mostly it just drowned the fires while they were trying to make entry. Okay, so again, I sort of touched on this earlier. So QFES legislation allows us to review building plans to provide advice to the legislated assessment manager, which in Queensland is the building certifier. But our scope of authority is restricted to a nominated group of fire safety installations, things like hydrants detection, the bells and whistles that relate to firefighting or notification. However, the provision for special hazards is captured, but only where the building certifier nominates that as a hazard. So the challenge that we faced, that in 2013, no one really thought lithium batteries were all that much of a hazard. I think our view has changed slightly on that. So we are advocating that they should always be treated as a special hazard for review and legislative purposes, and that proposes or allows further discussion. Again, there was important to note that no information on the design of the content of the battery was involved in any stage of the building approvals process, and neither was it required at this time in history. So it's an important part of discussions going forward. And as you can see, the only things the NCC really required was a nominated type of FRL, arguably effective or not, and smoke detection in the battery room. So I'll make a caveat here that this was the National Construction Code 2019. There is a new National Construction Code 2022, which is due to be released shortly. It's currently in the final stages of publishing. It was held up for various reasons that I won't really go into. But there is a particular clause, E110, for the provision of special hazards, and it argues, or it nominates, that suitable additional provision must be made for special problems of fighting a fire may arise because of the nature or quantity of materials stored, displayed, or used in the building, or the location of the building in regards to firefighting water. So I don't know about you, but as a firefighter, I consider that lithium batteries do provide special problems for me as a firefighter because of the nature or quantity of those materials. So we are advocating the invocation of special hazard E110 every day of the week. Problematically, the existing NCC only specifies that these separation of equipment is required above a capacity of 200 kilowatts. So if your system is above that, there's currently no specifications, guidance for what you need to do, no requirement for separation, and the specification for smoke exhaust is only, again, very particular to an individual specification where there may be individual requirements, and I won't drag you too much through that. So suffice to say, the building code is arguably has not considered or is not designed or intended for the installation of this kind of equipment into future building design. So the development and design of this kind of chemistry has outrun or outweighed the design capacity of the original intention. Okay, so in terms of firefighting intervention, again, I would argue these are the same things for fire investigators. In this case, there was unknown occupants, so they had no idea of what was in the room. So signage, there was no hazmat signage to indicate what was in the building. There was absence of defined intervention protocols, and the issues of the capability to sustain. So again, post-incident review, if you're going to one of these incidents, really important to understand, to identify what the hazard is, where is it, and what are the ongoing risks. In terms of hazard recovery, or again, I would argue any kind of site appraisal on approach to these kind of incidents. Atmospheric exposure is one, chemical residue runoff, fire stream runoff, handover and decontamination. Obviously, as fire investigators, that becomes a critical incident issue because we are attending post-incident. So we're rocking up to this thing after the fire's gone, after everyone's left. So it's very difficult to know what's been moved, what's been left, what's the state of charge, what's the chemistry involved. So I would suggest a pretty dynamic risk assessment is required before you make entry in or around these kind of systems. Equally, anything that's recovered from the site has had to have significant transportation and long-term storage issues. And again, just anecdotally, the reported chemical residues from within the fire scene were things like hydrogen fluoride, hydrogen chloride, sulfur dioxide, sulfur cyanide, and excessive carbon monoxide. So HF, if you're not familiar, is the one that goes through your skin, chews your bones from the inside out. Not really the kind you want to be having a bath in. So again, production of these chemicals is still, it's evident that they are produced in the decomposition. Still, the science is out about in what concentrations. So it's pretty relevant that a high level of personal protection on approach to these kind of incidents is a really important factor. I'd equally like to acknowledge Griffith Uni and their design considerations. They are looking to separate storage to individual BESS systems that don't have a capacity in excess of 200 kilowatts. They're looking to do their own individual FRL specifications. So they're going to calculate what the credible fire load of each battery bank is and promote their own FRL separation, irrespective of what the code may or not require. They're looking at specific gaseous detection systems. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the Arizona incident where the gaseous detection system did activate, did suppress the initial fire, but did nothing to stop the decomposition of the battery cells. Fire is rocked up, opened the doors, ventilation incursion, explosive mix, blew themselves back across the paddock. So again, gaseous detection or initial knockdown is good for the first stage, but unless there is ventilation of the compartment prior to entry, there's massive issues there. And again, they're considering internal atmospheric pressure sensors. So sort of the reverse of a fusible link smoke damper that activates and isolates the compartment. They're looking at considering a spring-loaded pressure relief valve, if you like, that at a predetermined internal pressure operates and provides ventilation to release that buildup of gases to stop the excess concentration. The question, of course, is where do those fumes go and where do you redirect it to? And then considering enhanced structural FRL separation. So where do we go from here? I can advise that since this incident has occurred, there's been a massive amount of research development. There's a lot of awareness both globally and nationally. All fire services are involved in an Australasian Fire Authority's Alternative Renewable Energies group, where we are reviewing all the information that's available to us. We're trying to develop good practice protocols. We're trying to provide information to the building legislators to say we believe there is a genuine and credible risk for occupants, structure, and first responders in and around these incidents, and we're advocating in those areas. So look, I'll call it quits there, but I'm very conscious of the time. I don't want to keep you all too late, so I'll pull up sumps there. But yeah, fascinating incident. In summary, be very, very careful post-incident overhaul or around them, and there's a lot of concerns around stranded energy or transport of damaged cells post-incident. Thanks very much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, Chris. There was a question. I got logged out. My internet died, and I come back in. And I missed the chat has gone missing from me. But there was a question there from Ben around the second alarm response. The scientific officer responded straight away. Ben,
yep.
Albert, is that the premise of your question? I can't see the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Mick. Yeah, just in relation to the second alarm response protocol, is that a standard response for the scientific officer, or is that like a specialist technician that looks at hazmat, or what is that role, and is that for specific buildings, or how is that then included in the response?
Within Queensland, we have a division of scientific officers who are hazmat trained scientists who respond to assist us with incidents of chemical nature. So they are effectively advice agency support to us on ground, on site. So they are scientific officers. So once we know what we're dealing with, we sort of go to them and go to the HAG guides or the IAG guides and figure out how we're supposed to be dealing with it. So they're effectively specialist advice. So they're not necessarily automatic response for a second alarm gas, but in this case, they knew by that stage that they were dealing with a lithium battery bank.
Thanks, Ben. Caroline, you got your hand up?
Yeah, hi, Carolyn Blake from Fire Rescue Victoria. Thanks, Chris. I think you might have just answered my question, because my question was going to be, were the firefighters, obviously they weren't initially aware that they were lithium-ion batteries, but at what point did they realise that that's what they were actually fighting, which is obviously a lot different to fighting some
Pretty much not until it was out.
Okay.
And so again, the time of day, the security guard doesn't necessarily know what was in there, but once the specialist site contacts arrive, so the alignment with what are we dealing with and what is in there was around about the 2-hour mark.
Okay, thank you.
And that comes back to the hazmat notification signage on the door, on approach. You know, again, arguably you need to know your own backyard, but we didn't even know this installation was in the building. So there's a lot of sort of questions about regional area knowledge, about information sharing between agencies. But again, no prescriptive requirement for hazardous placarding on this particular room. So all they had was a little sign said electrical hazard, do not enter.
Yes, not much of a sign, is it? Phil's asking, what level of protective equipment is suitable for investigating such scenes? Very, very good question. You have a go first, Chris, and then I will see if you're right or wrong.
Look, it's not really me to prescribe or to nominate, but obviously I'd say that you should be in a chemically protective footwear and clothing that is not absorbive. So, you know, if you've got some kind of, again, it depends what you're doing, you know, so the first thing I would suggest is you need atmospheric sampling. You've got to know what the atmosphere is. So whether you need positive pressure respiration or whatever, and then it's depending on what you're intending to do. If you're intending to do any kind of overhaul, then you need absolutely something that's going to stop any kind of absorption. So that becomes like chemical resistant over trousers and gloves and such like. So, but principally it would be atmospheric protection. So high level respirator, in this case, it might need even to be a specific canvas to respirator if you know what's in there. And again, in the absence of that, the question is, what's the need to enter? You know, so there's a risk assessment in terms of what's the requirement to enter that atmosphere for the level of overhaul that's required. And again, I appreciate everyone has different aspects of that response protocol, whether you're a first responder agency or a private investigator doing the scene several days or shortly after the fire incident occurred. But finding out what is in there is the first thing you should always do. So risk assessment, get as much information as you can about it, go through the guides that recommend the relevant specifications, but certainly respiratory protection first and foremost, and then chemical exposure for any kind of direct contact with the residual debris. That's my best response.
And if I could just say, yeah, also that's really good. The IAAI has a health and safety, very big health and safety committee. And what they do is they do produce good resources. One of them is called the IAAI white paper. If you Google that, I've just put it in the chat, that you can download the PDF for that. It didn't quite work. But yeah, anyway, if you go IAAIwhitepaper.com, there it is there. It will give you the health and safety requirements for all fire investigation, all different types of fire investigations. And that is a great resource because, as you are all aware or should be aware, fire investigation is a dangerous occupation. And over many years, a lot of people have died due to, long-term cancers and things like that. So, yeah, good question, very relevant question to have good PPE when investigating such of these incidents. And certainly lithium-ion batteries is a sort of a fairly new occurrence in terms of what we are investigating, but there are a lot of hazards associated with doing such things. So please be safe out there and protect yourselves. Caroline had a question for you now. No? No worries. Any other questions for Chris while he's here?
I can see the chat. I'm just trying to scroll through it. But no, I think, yeah, what season? You've put the YouTube address up for the response, but yeah, that's on the if you've recorded, it's on the slide presentation, third slide in anyway. But
Yeah. I just quickly Googled it and found it, and it's at 53 seconds is where that deflagration occurs. So that's good.
oh, that's the footage. Yep.
Yeah, it was
Yeah,
that
so
news channel or something, that news.
Yeah, so the link I put up was to the building. It was an overview of the building, not the YouTube
Oh,
footage. So
right,
yeah,
sorry,
the
right.
Griffith Uni footage does show the flashback, and I've edited that, so you'll have to troll through a bit. But they put the fire porn at the start, as they tend to do when the external YouTubers. But yeah,
Sure.
the link that I put up was actually for the building, so that explains how the system works. So just if you're interested, it's a pretty interesting overview as to how the building, because I didn't have the time to explain how complex it was, but yeah.
We will be putting this on our YouTube channel, the recording, soon. We'll give us some time to do that. But yeah, that'll be there for everyone to look and pass on to whoever wants it. But yeah, these type of incidents, even though Chris has given this presentation before, if you have not seen it before, we wanted to obviously redo this because these incidents are going to be occurring more and more. If you are looking at places like the US and the UK and Europe, there's a lot of videos out there. There's a lot of information out there about these type of incidents. We haven't seen too many in this country. That's why this one is really, really interesting to see how we reacted and the investigation into it. So this gives us a really good insight into what QFES did and how they reacted, how they investigated, and certainly those findings going towards changes to NCC and stuff like that to help better prepare, buildings for these type of incidents in the future. If any other questions for Chris, or I think that's about it. Listen, Chris, thanks a lot for your time. I can see you're still in the office there.
Yeah,
so
I am. Yeah,
you're doing a bit of overtime, which is great, which is not that good. But I mean, we do appreciate you staying back from your normal days at work and giving us your time today. I know you've given this presentation before, but it's really good to hear it again. And I know our members and guests have certainly appreciated the information you provided. Really good case study around this type of incident. I will see you one day, and thank you with some little gift in the future to present to you for your time. I owe you something for that. Not a problem.
All right.
Thank you to everyone attending. Again, we've got a really good turnout tonight. We're looking at our next education night to being in April. More information on that to follow. And if you have any ideas on what education nights or topics that you would like to hear about, certainly get in contact with myself, Mark Pellegrino, about what that may be. So from all of us, thank you again. We'll stop the recording, Bobby, and we'll again see you next time.
Thank you very much. All the best.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
See you somewhere.